The number that stopped me was 9 million. Not the wars. Not the plagues. 9 million women, executed across 3 centuries in Europe, for the crime of knowing how to heal. That number is contested. Some historians say 50,000. Others say hundreds of thousands. The variance itself tells you something. We aren't entirely sure how many people were killed for the practice of medicine. Think about that for a moment. You cannot misplace the death toll of a war. You can misplace the death toll of a purge. You misplace what you don't want to count. I found this while researching something else entirely: the history of pharmaceutical regulation. I was looking for the moment when medicine became an industry, when it stopped being knowledge passed between people and became a product sold by institutions. And every trail I followed led me backward, to the same vanishing point. To a woman in a garden. To smoke rising over a village square. To a document signed by men who stood to inherit everything she knew. The story I'm about to walk you through is not simple. It involves medicine, money, religion, gender, and the systematic erasure of a knowledge system that had served human communities for thousands of years. Some of what I'll share is documented history. Some of it is pattern, recurring shapes in the archive that suggest coordination where no coordination has been officially acknowledged. I don't have answers. Only patterns. But once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Let me start with what the official history tells us, because it deserves a fair hearing before we interrogate it. The official story goes like this. Medieval Europe was a dangerous place, riddled with superstition and folk practice that did more harm than good. Women who claimed healing abilities were often practicing rituals rooted in pagan tradition, herbalism mixed with prayer, midwifery tangled with omen reading, and treatments that ranged from harmless to actively dangerous. The witch trials, in this framing, were a cultural pathology, mass hysteria, religious extremism, social scapegoating during periods of crisis like the Black Death or the Little Ice Age. The women who died were tragic victims of ignorance, not a targeted professional class. The rise of formal medicine, in this narrative, was progress. Universities began training physicians in the 13th and 14th centuries. Anatomy was studied. Dissection was permitted cautiously, in controlled academic settings. Scientific method was applied, however clumsily, to the human body. The transition from folk healer to licensed physician was painful, yes, but it was the birth of modern medicine. We traded superstition for science. This is the mainstream explanation. And it's not entirely wrong. There were dangerous practices in folk medicine. There was hysteria in the witch trials. And modern medicine, for all its failures, has done extraordinary things. But let me ask you to hold the official story loosely for a moment. Because there are numbers in this history that don't fit neatly inside it. And there are documents, sitting in archives in Edinburgh, in Cologne, in Rome, that tell a different story about what was actually being eliminated, and why. Let's start with the numbers. By the 12th century, women healers in Europe operated within a recognized, if informal, professional network. They served as midwives, herbalists, wound dressers, and what we might today call general practitioners for communities that had no other access to care. In England alone, historical records from the 13th century reference women practitioners in every major town. Not one or two. Dozens. They charged fees. They maintained apprenticeships. They passed knowledge through lineage, through manuscripts, through oral tradition refined across generations. This is not fringe scholarship. This is documented in the work of historians including Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English, whose research, compiled from guild records and ecclesiastical court documents, shows that women constituted the primary healthcare providers for European peasant communities for over a millennium. The knowledge they held, botanical pharmacology, obstetric technique, wound management, fever treatment, was empirically derived. Tested in the most brutal possible laboratory, a world where everyone was always sick, where childbirth killed 1 in 10, where the wrong remedy meant the wrong death. They were good at what they did. The records suggest this, not sentimentally, but functionally. Communities returned to the same healers. Reputations spread across villages. The demand never disappeared. What disappeared was the supply. Between 1250 and 1350, a series of institutional documents began to accumulate in the archives of European universities and the Catholic Church. In 1272, the University of Paris formally prohibited women from practicing medicine. In 1322, a woman named Jacoba Felicie was tried in Paris for illegal medical practice. The charges against her included the following: she examined patients, prescribed herbal treatments, and collected fees. The prosecution acknowledged that she had achieved cures her licensed male counterparts had failed to achieve. She was convicted and fined regardless. The prosecution's logic is worth sitting with. It was not that she was practicing bad medicine. It was that she was practicing medicine at all. The university's physician guild argued that a woman could not be permitted to practice even if she were capable, because permission would undermine the authority of those the institution had certified. The timeline isn't subtle. The formal licensing of male physicians and the formal prohibition of female practitioners occurred within the same institutional moment. The same decades. The same documents. The same authorities. Speaking of documents, there's one that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor. It became the primary manual for witch trial prosecution across Europe, translated into multiple languages, printed in 14 editions by 1520. It is often discussed as a theological document, a product of religious zealotry, a window into medieval superstition. And it is all of those things. But buried in its pages is a passage that has always unsettled me. Kramer writes specifically about healers. About women who use herbs and roots. He distinguishes between healing with prayer, acceptable, and healing with knowledge, suspect. The woman who calls on God when she treats a fever is a Christian. The woman who knows which root will bring the fever down without calling on God is something else. The knowledge itself, in Kramer's framing, is the evidence of transgression. To know medicine without having been taught medicine by the Church or its sanctioned institutions is to have learned it from somewhere else. And in his taxonomy, somewhere else had only one address. This is a remarkable argument. It is an argument against empirical knowledge, against trial and error refinement of botanical treatment, against the transmission of healing information between women outside of male institutional oversight. And it was used, successfully, to prosecute tens of thousands of people. What no one explains is why this framing was so legally effective. Religious hysteria doesn't fully account for it. Courts in the late medieval period were often sophisticated enough to distinguish between religious enthusiasm and actionable charges. Something else was operating in the infrastructure of these prosecutions. Something institutional. Which brings me to the guilds. The medical guilds of late medieval Europe were among the most powerful professional organizations on the continent. In England, the Company of Barber Surgeons held a royal charter from 1540, but the push for exclusive licensing began over 2 centuries earlier. Guild members lobbied, persistently, for legal prohibition of unlicensed practice. They petitioned city councils. They brought cases before magistrates. They aligned themselves strategically with church authorities who were simultaneously developing the legal infrastructure of witch prosecution. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that the medical guilds coordinated the witch trials. The documentary record does not support that specific claim. What the documentary record does support is something perhaps more disturbing: parallel institutional development, moving in the same direction, at the same time, producing the same outcome. By 1400, unlicensed medicine was a prosecutable offense in most of urban Europe. By 1550, unlicensed medicine was, in many jurisdictions, an indicator of witchcraft. The legal path from female healer to suspected witch was surprisingly short, and the overlap between the two prosecution systems was not accidental. Inquisitors cited medical practice. Guild documents cited inquisitorial findings. The two systems quoted each other into authority. The pattern indicates coordination, or at minimum, mutual reinforcement. Two institutions with adjacent interests found that each other's authority amplified their own. The part that keeps me up at night is what was lost in the burning. Here is where the history becomes archaeological. The knowledge held by traditional European healers was not primarily oral, as the official narrative tends to imply. There were manuscripts, recipe books, though that word domesticates them, they were pharmacopoeias, herbals, midwifery manuals, obstetric records. Some of these survived, preserved in monasteries that had their own reasons for maintaining medical libraries. Many did not. The British Museum holds fragments of what scholars believe was a broader manuscript tradition of English folk medicine, estimated from internal references to have encompassed hundreds of texts, of which perhaps 30 survive in any form. The gaps are not random. The most practical texts, the ones with specific dosages, the ones describing surgical techniques, the ones detailing management of difficult labor, are most absent. The texts that survive tend to be the more mystical ones, the ones that could be framed as spiritual rather than technical. You do not accidentally lose the technical manuals and keep the prayers. That is a selective destruction. At the Wellcome Collection in London, there are court records from the 16th and 17th centuries documenting the confiscation of books of physic from accused witches. These books were rarely preserved as evidence. They were destroyed as evidence. The logic of the prosecution required that the knowledge they contained be attributed to diabolical origin, and a readable herbal, legible and empirically organized, would have complicated that attribution considerably. There is a catalogue, assembled by German historian Gunnar Heinzen in the 1980s, that attempts to reconstruct, from legal records, from trial transcripts, from property confiscations, the types of knowledge documented as present in the possession of accused witches. The list includes contraceptive preparations, labor induction agents, wound antiseptics, fungal remedies, treatments for respiratory infection. Many of these are now recognized as pharmacologically active compounds. Some of them represent knowledge that Western medicine would not rediscover, through clinical trial and pharmaceutical development, for another 3 or 4 centuries. The timing is almost theatrical. Let me be fair to the official narrative one more time, because this is the point where speculative history most easily goes wrong. There is a counter-argument worth taking seriously. It runs like this: the correlation between the suppression of folk healers and the rise of formal medicine does not prove causation. Medicine was professionalizing across the same period for reasons that had nothing to do with gender or the elimination of competitors. The scientific revolution, the printing press, the growth of universities, all of these transformed the landscape of knowledge. The fact that formal medicine benefited from the elimination of its informal competitors does not mean it engineered that elimination. This is a reasonable argument. I find myself persuaded by parts of it. The witch trials were not a pharmaceutical conspiracy. The Inquisition did not take marching orders from guild masters. But here's what matters. Whether or not there was coordination, the outcome was identical to what coordination would have produced. The knowledge was destroyed. The practitioners were eliminated. The monopoly was established. And the new monopoly, the licensed, guild-controlled, university-certified medical profession, inherited patients who no longer had other options. In economics, we call this a captured market. The question of whether the capture was intentional is less important than the question of who holds the capture now. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe the destruction of female medical knowledge was simply collateral damage, the unfortunate casualty of a broader cultural trauma that we have correctly identified as religious hysteria and misogyny. Maybe the pharmaceutical industry that rose from the ashes of traditional medicine did so organically, without inheriting any structural benefit from the elimination of its predecessors. Maybe. But consider the following sequence. In 1864, the American Medical Association, founded in 1847, itself a guild organization in the tradition of its European predecessors, published a formal report recommending the criminalization of abortion services. The women who had historically provided those services, along with midwifery and general obstetric care, were overwhelmingly unlicensed practitioners. The criminalization of abortion coincided with an AMA campaign against midwifery and for the medicalization of childbirth under the supervision of licensed, male, obstetricians. By 1900, the midwife, still delivering the majority of American babies as recently as 1890, had been largely replaced by the hospital physician. The knowledge she carried did not transfer smoothly into the new system. Elements of it were retained, studied, sometimes validated. Many others were simply lost, not through any decision, but through the disappearance of the people who held them. In 1910, the Flexner Report, commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and the AMA, recommended the closure of most American medical schools, particularly those admitting women and black students. Of 155 medical schools operating in 1906, 113 were closed or merged within 20 years. The ones that survived were those aligned with the university model, white, male, and funded. The pattern does not begin in 1487 with the Malleus Maleficarum. It does not end in 1910 with the Flexner Report. It describes an arc across 600 years. An arc that begins with women in gardens, knowing which plants bring fever down, and ends with a pharmaceutical market worth over $1 trillion annually, in which the knowledge of those gardens is proprietary, patented, and available for purchase. I want to return to where I started. To the number. Whether 9 million or 50,000, the women killed during the witch trials represented the practitioner class of European medicine for over a millennium. Their elimination was not a historical accident. It was a historical event, documented, prosecuted, institutionally supported, and strategically timed. The archive that survived them is incomplete by design. The records of their knowledge exist in fragments, in court documents that catalogued what was confiscated before it was burned, in the pharmacological validation of plants they used that Western medicine would take centuries to rediscover. There is a manuscript held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, MS Rawlinson D. 1221, which contains a partial list of remedies attributed to a practitioner identified only as the Woman of Hexham, executed in 1528. The list includes preparations for infection, for pain, for difficult labor. Scholars who have examined it note that several of the botanical compounds described align with substances now used in contemporary medicine. The manuscript has been studied by exactly 4 researchers since it was catalogued in 1954. It is sitting in a filing cabinet, in a library, unsealed, available to anyone with a reader's card. Most of what she knew died with her. What survived is collecting archival dust in Oxford. And here is what I cannot stop thinking about. The women who came before her, the ones whose names we don't have, whose manuscripts were burned before they could be catalogued, whose knowledge died with them in squares we can no longer identify, they knew things. Empirical things. Things that worked. Things they had tested in the most brutal laboratory imaginable and refined across generations because the alternative was watching the people they loved die. We chose an institution over that knowledge. The institution chose itself over that knowledge. And we are still living with the architecture that choice built. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And the oldest pattern I know is this: when someone is killed for what they know, the first question worth asking is who benefits from the not knowing. That question has been sitting in Hexham since 1528. We still haven't answered it.